Welcome to Christian Theological Seminary's lifelong learning webinar series entitled Navigating a Disorienting Age. CTS is committed to being an academic community that embodies God's liberative, restorative, and life-affirming message. This year, as we celebrate our 100th anniversary, we're very excited to continue this vision with all of you. Today's webinar is part of our lifelong learning series called Our Life in Common. The series offers valuable perspectives and resources for navigating the challenges of our times, fostering resilience, connection, and growth within congregations. In today's session, we'll examine the intersections of love, desire, and identity through the lens of Scripture. Our guest will guide us in an exploration of how religious texts can inform and shape our understanding of sexuality and personal identity, and how our understanding of sexuality and identity can inform and shape our understanding of religious texts. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Tim McNinch, Assistant Professor of Hebrew Bible and Director of the Master of Theological Studies degree program here at CTS. As a fellow biblical scholar, I'm especially excited to welcome our distinguished guest. But first, let's let my co-host, Dean Lozada, really more of a sidekick here, take a moment to introduce himself.
Thank you, Tim. Hello, welcome. I'm Francisco Lozada. I'm the Vice President for Faculty Affairs and Dean of the Faculty. And like my colleague, Dr. McNinch, I am very excited to have Dr. Ken Stone with us today. For self-disclosure purposes, I've known Dr. Stone since we were graduate students at Vanderbilt Divinity School many, many years ago, and we spent some hours in the refectory discussing all sorts of matters. But I won't embarrass him here this afternoon. But I'm really excited to be very, very impressed in his intellectual journey from as a graduate student to the present. Very much, I would argue, the example, what I would call sort of the cultural critic in the world today. So thank you. And welcome, Ken.
So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ken Stone. Dr. Stone is Distinguished Service Professor and Professor of Bible, Culture, and Hermeneutics at Chicago Theological Seminary. Well, we'll try to get you here. Dr. Stone is celebrated in my own field, biblical studies, for his contributions to the intersections between the Bible and critical theory, gender and sexuality as it relates to biblical interpretation, and more recently, pioneering work in the implications of animal and ecological studies for our understanding of the Bible. If you enjoy what you hear today and want more, we'd recommend hunting down a copy of his book, Practicing Safer Texts, Food, Sex, and Bible in Queer Perspective, or his co-edited volume with Teresa Hornsby, Bible Trouble, Queer Reading at the Boundaries of Biblical Scholarship. In my own reading, Dr. Stone has been a clarifying and really convicting voice, pushing me to consider not only what I read about sexuality and identity in Scripture, but also how I read, what sorts of assumptions and biases and kind of normative categories I bring to the text. By the way, with that insight in mind, this January, I'm offering an elective course here at CTS that engages biblical interpretation and LGBTQ plus identity. One of my goals for the course is that we come away from it with an appreciation for gender and sexual identity, not just as a topic or object of study, but even more as a subjective vantage point, a queer lens, so to speak, for illuminating the text. And if I have any success in teaching that course, it will be due in no small part to the helpful influence of Dr. Stone's scholarship. So would you join me in welcoming to CTS's Our Life in Common series, Dr. Ken Stone? The stage is yours.
Thank you, Dr. McNinch and Dean Lozada, and welcome everyone. I appreciate you all being here. I'm sure many of you have busy lives and there's a lot going on in our world at the moment. I don't need to elaborate on that. So I want to honor your time. What I have in mind is I'm going to share a few thoughts for you today for about 30 minutes, but then I also want to leave some time for us to have some conversation or Q&A. And on the Q&A, I should mention that while I'm talking, I'm going to hit on several points rather quickly. A couple of them touch on matters of biblical scholarship. And initially, at least, I'm going to leave out some of the technical details. But if you're interested in those, we can come back to them during the Q&A if you want to explore a point in more detail. So our topic for today has to do with navigating faith and sexuality. That's a little bit vague, and there are a lot of ways to think about that topic. So I want to say something first about where I'm coming from. As was mentioned already, I teach at Chicago Theological Seminary. We sometimes call it the other CTS. I've been teaching there for more than 25 years, so it's a part of who I am. And my primary faculty title is Professor of Bible, Culture, and Hermeneutics. What does that mean? By culture, and I'm going through this just to say a little bit about where I'm coming from. By culture, I mean both ancient and modern cultures. In other words, I'm interested in both the ancient cultures that gave us the Bible and the contemporary cultures in which we read it. I think both of those have to be taken into account. Whenever we read the Bible, as you all know, we're reading an ancient text that is thoroughly shaped by its ancient culture, and we have to understand some things about that ancient culture if we want to understand what the books of the Bible meant when they were written. But also, whenever we read the Bible, we're reading it as inhabitants of the 21st century, thoroughly shaped by our own cultures. So we have to think about that side of the equation as well, and I will today. By hermeneutics, I mean, first of all, interpretation, theories of interpretation, but even more so practices of interpretation. In other words, how we read and make sense of significant religious texts. And among those religious texts, I do focus much of my teaching and writing on the Bible. I'm especially interested in the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament. And within the study of the Hebrew Bible, one of my long-term research interests involves matters of sexuality and gender and kinship or family. It's something I've written about academically, something I speak about as a seminary professor. So that's where I'm coming from academically. But I'm not only a seminary professor. I'm a member of the United Church of Christ. So I have a stake not only in the academic study of sexuality and kinship in the Bible, but also how that relates to the use of the Bible as a resource in communities of faith. I'm a white man living in the United States, and I'm also gay. That's important to say because it does shape the perspective I bring to my religious identity and the perspective I bring to biblical interpretation. It doesn't override my use of tools of biblical scholarship, but it's a part of who I am, a part of the identity I bring with me whenever I engage a text, just as each of you brings various parts of who you are to your own biblical interpretation. We all start from some place when we read biblical literature based on our backgrounds and our identities or identifications. And what we see depends on where we stand. That's true for all of us. And from whatever place we're standing, we establish some relationship with our faith tradition and with its sacred text. And that's what I'm interested in thinking about with you. How do we navigate the relationships among faith, our sexuality, and biblical interpretation? How do we think about those relationships? How do we navigate them? Notice that I'm emphasizing the word relationships because I want us to think about the interconnections among faith, sexuality, and biblical interpretation. So what can we say about those relationships? How do we understand them? Well, the first thing I want to say about those relationships is it's complicated. The relationship status is complicated. You'll recognize that language, of course, if you've spent any time on social media. I actually went and checked while I was getting ready for today, and this is still an option on Facebook. under relationship. You can be single, you can be married, you can be divorced, or you can just say it's complicated. And of course, we all know people for whom this is the best description of their relationship status. Maybe it's true for you. We all know this. We may not talk about it all the time, but we know that we live in a messy world with a lot of complicated relationships, and we understand that people have to navigate those complications. Well, one of the things I want to suggest is that this is not only a useful way to think about our romantic or sexual relationships. If someone asks you, what is your relationship with the Bible? Quite often, the best answer is, it's complicated. It is complicated. That's not the answer that we've been taught to give. In fact, a lot of people turn to the Bible or their faith tradition because they're looking for something simple and reliable in this very complicated, messy world. That's an understandable desire. Nevertheless, I think it's true that for a lot of people, the relationship we actually have to the Bible and the relationship that our sexualities actually have to the Bible and our gender identifications, those are all complicated relationships. And we need to name that more than we do. Now, some of you may be thinking that it seems a little strange to talk about our relationship with the Bible by making an analogy with our sexual relationships. But in fact, I want to push that even a little further. One of the things that I want to suggest is that in thinking about our relationship with biblical interpretation, we can usefully adopt a model that actually comes from the world of sexuality and apply that model of sexuality to our relationship with biblical interpretation. More specifically, as was mentioned a moment ago, I wrote a book a number of years ago now that I titled Practicing Safer Texts. Practicing Safer Texts. Obviously, safer text is a kind of play on the phrase safer sex, and it's not just an attempt to be funny or cute. I actually mean something pragmatic, and I would argue important when I use that phrase and apply it to biblical interpretation. More specifically, I'm suggesting that biblical interpretation has a kind of a two-sided character. On the one hand, biblical interpretation can be valuable. It can be nourishing. It can be pleasurable. It can be life-giving. That's why so many people are drawn to it. But on the other hand, biblical interpretation often carries with it certain kinds of risks. There is always some danger that biblical interpretation will result in damage, that it will result in harm for somebody. And I want to argue that we should try to reduce that harm. In fact, we might also say that what we need is some harm reduction in biblical interpretation. Here again, as with it's complicated and practicing safer text, when I use the phrase harm reduction, I'm picking up a phrase from our contemporary culture that's meaningful to a lot of people involved in community work and addiction work, and I'm applying it to biblical interpretation. We want to keep harm to a minimum. We want to reduce the possibility that our biblical interpretation will result in harm to ourselves or to others. So we're talking about a sort of pragmatic approach to biblical interpretation. And I want to really emphasize that. I believe very much in a kind of pragmatic approach. Even when I'm using academic theories of interpretation, I think we ought to be pragmatic in our approach to biblical interpretation. And we need to find ways of making it life affirming, even though we know that for many people, biblical interpretation does also carry some risk. And that's why we need to practice, in my view, safer text. Now, I actually first started thinking about this model of biblical interpretation as practicing safer text while working on questions about gays and lesbians and the Bible, or about so-called queer biblical interpretation, as was mentioned earlier. Safer text was useful in that context because, as you all know, during the AIDS crisis, gay men, not that it's over, but during the worst of it, gay men had worked out some very sophisticated but pragmatic approaches to sexual risk. approaches that can be and have been modified over time. As circumstances change, you modify your approach, change with respect to viruses, medications, and so forth. That's an actual learning from gay experiences dealing with risk that I believe in relying upon, not only with respect to sexuality. So one of the issues on my mind as a biblical scholar, when I think about that, is the fact that 3 or 4 or 5 biblical texts that can be understood as condemnations of homosexuality, they also function sometimes to incite violence, physical or otherwise, against LGBT persons. They're dangerous texts in that sense. That's what I had in mind when I adopted the model, and that's actually still the case. Today, a lot more of the violence is aimed at trans people, but the dynamics are still quite similar. So we could explore that as an example of potential harm or danger, how biblical interpretation results in anti-LGBT violence and discrimination. In fact, that's where I had originally planned to focus a lot of my comments today, and we can come back to that if you have questions. It'll be relevant throughout. But I've decided instead to focus on a related but slightly different issue as a way to work into this. I want to focus on some questions having to do with the Bible and women, and with the attitudes we adopt towards women's sexuality, women's sexual agency, their ability to act in society, violence against women, and so forth. And I want to do so by looking at an issue that has a fairly broad relevance, and that is the issue of biblical marriage and the place of women in it. I decided to focus a little more on this issue today because right now there is an important conversation taking place in our society about how much right a woman has to make decisions about her own body and her own sexual health. I'm not going to get into the specific political controversies that animate that conversation. You already know them. But one of the things that I've been thinking about as this conversation has been taking place is the fact that some of the assumptions being resurfaced in our society at the moment, such as the assumption that certain men have the right to constrain women's autonomy around matters of sexuality and so forth, those assumptions, I think, actually have some roots in ideas that we get from the Bible, dangerous ideas that we get from the Bible. So matters of women's sexuality, like matters of gay sexuality, have become significant issues for us to think about in terms of practicing safer text. And we can explore this by just recalling some biblical ideas about what we sometimes call the institution of marriage. Today, when most of us think about marriage, we usually think about this in terms of a particular life narrative. We imagine 2 people, usually of similar age, desiring one another, falling in love, making a public commitment to one another, ideally to live happily ever after, or at least for a long time. That at least is one of the complications I referred to earlier. There are legal benefits to this union in our society, but in most cases, we don't assume that the legal benefits are the only motivation for getting married. We usually assume some kind of emotional rationale, hence the language of being in love, which motivates so much of our popular culture. And most often, it is still assumed that the 2 people involved in that arrangement are a man and a woman. That's a little less uniform today, now that same-sex marriage is legal. Still, even same-sex marriage is often shaped by this overall narrative. I am myself legally married to my partner, and I'm very aware of the force of these social expectations about what marriage is. Now, a lot of people, I think, probably assume that the basic framework for our assumptions about marriage, at least the heterosexual version of it, can be found in the Bible. And there are some texts that can be read in terms of such a framework, but the fit is not perfect. And we can see this by looking carefully at what language the Hebrew Bible actually uses about marriage. If we want to know what the Bible says about marriage, one of the things we might do is look up words like marriage, husband, wife. And if you go looking for those words in your English Bibles, you can find them. You can find those words in your English Bibles. But in fact, as some of you I'm sure know, if you're reading the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament in Hebrew, one of the things you discover is that there are not actually words that literally correspond to our English words marriage, husband, or wife. In Hebrew, the words that we translate as husband and wife are, in most cases, actually the words for man and woman, the straightforward words for man and woman. Translators decide whether to translate these words as man and woman or husband and wife based solely on context. Now, that might not seem like such a big deal because translation is always dependent on context. Pragmatically, it's necessary. But in the case of the Bible, I think the use of the words husband and wife instead of man and woman does sometimes obscure the fact that ancient kinship conventions actually seem to be rather different from our own. We see husband and wife and we think, oh, this is like our system of marriage. But when we look a little closer, things are less clear. I mentioned that there's no word for marriage in the Hebrew Bible. What language is used then to indicate something like marriage? Well, literally, the text usually refers not to marriage, but rather to the giving and taking of women. That is to say, when a marriage takes place in the Bible, it's almost never described as a matter of a man and a woman falling in love and then getting married. Literally, it's usually a matter of a man taking a woman, and often of a father giving his daughter to another man as that man's woman. If we were in class, we could spend a while on examples. I'm just going to run through. In Judges 3:6, the Israelites took daughters from their neighbors, and the Israelites gave daughters to their neighbors. Right there's a perfect description of biblical marriage. Give daughters, take daughters. In Genesis 4:19, Lamech took two women. Genesis 36:2, Esau took women from the Canaanites. In Genesis 25:1, Abraham took another woman after Sarah. Genesis 29, Laban takes and gives his two daughters to Jacob, and so on. I could go on with these examples for a long time. Those are more literal renditions of what we actually see happening in the Bible. And that's one of the reasons why you will sometimes hear scholars point out that marriage in the Bible is often a kind of property relation because it's a matter of giving and taking. And it's not perfectly described as a property relation. There's a little bit of difference there. But so we do have something like marriage here. But it's not exactly what we would call marriage today either. It's a giving and taking of women. And we find that motivating a lot of the text throughout the Bible. And of course, this giving and taking of women is something that is done by and between men. Men are the ones in the Hebrew Bible who have control over women's sexuality in a lot of parts of the Hebrew Bible. I should qualify that. A father has control over his daughter's sexuality. So he can choose to give it away to someone else, even as part of an economic transaction, such as when Laban gives his two daughters to Jacob in return for Jacob's working for him. So when marriage or something like marriage is talked about in the Bible, it's usually understood not as a mutual agreement between two equals who fall in love and decide to get married, a husband and a wife, but rather as a matter of one man taking a woman to be his woman, and sometimes as a father giving his daughter to another man. A woman doesn't just become property when she gets married. She is already the property of her father, and she becomes the property of another man. And we see this social process in action in quite a number of places in the Bible. Let me give just one other revealing example from the Ten Commandments. I use this example because we often think of the Ten Commandments as being one of the most universally applicable sections of the Hebrew Bible. In fact, Christians who often acknowledge that we don't literally follow many of the laws in the Hebrew Bible do often claim that we're still following the Ten Commandments, right? The idea seems to be that maybe the rest of the laws are culturally specific, even culturally relative, but surely the Ten Commandments are universally applicable to everyone. They apply to all of us in the same way, right? Well, maybe not. Maybe they don't apply to all of us in the same way. Because listen carefully to these words from Exodus 20:17. You will not covet the house of your neighbor. You will not covet the woman of your neighbor, or his male slave, or his female slave, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now, this is actually one of many places where English translators usually choose to render the word woman as wife. I've translated a little more literally here and just left it as woman. But in either translation, we can see that women are listed alongside male slaves, female slaves, oxen, and donkeys as things that one man has and another man might want. And in fact, if you're reading this in Hebrew, you can actually see the masculine personal pronouns a little more clearly and understand that this is men talking to men about their system of marriage. There are a lot more examples I could give, but you get my point. Throughout the Bible, many, perhaps most references to marriage are actually a matter of one man taking a woman, sometimes of another man giving a woman. There are a few places in the Bible where we find a reference to a woman loving a man. An example would be Michal, the daughter of Saul, who loves David in the books of Samuel. But Michal's brother, Jonathan, also famously loves David. The same terminology is used. And so there isn't any special value placed on Michal's emotional relationship with David in comparison with Jonathan's relationship. In fact, there's a little more emphasis in David's relationship and the emotion in David's relationship with Jonathan than in David's relationship with Michal. Now, all of this might seem like, here goes a biblical scholar quibbling over linguistic details. But in that broader set of texts, we can also find stories in the Bible where the whole thing plays out in a quite dangerous way. I'm just going to give one example. In Judges 21, there's a story seldom read about how the men of the tribe of Benjamin need to get 600 women as what we might call wives. Now, the details leading up to why they need this, it's actually it's a very troubling story in the Bible that also sheds a lot of light on violence against women. But I'm going to stick just with this one little incident in Judges 21 where the Benjaminites need 600 women. What do? They kidnap them. That's how they get their wives. They kidnap them. So you don't just give and take women in a peaceful way. This can happen quite violently. It's an active acquisition of a woman that can take the form of force and violence. Sometimes a woman gives her consent, such as Rebecca, but that's actually rare in the Hebrew Bible to see a reference to a woman giving consent. Now, there's a lot more I could say here about the issue of women in the Bible and in biblical marriages. If you ever want to take a class with me, I'll be glad to send you details. But one of the things that should be clear from what I've said, to come back to where I started, is that biblical views on marriage don't really have that much to do with what most of us are looking for from marriage. And when people appeal rhetorically to the so-called biblical view of marriage to explain their opposition to same-sex marriage, for example, you can see why I'm not especially impressed with that particular argument. But for my point here, the thing I want to emphasize is we can see in this example of marriage and the role of women in marriage in the Hebrew Bible, we can see the danger side of practicing safer text. We can see the risk. Trying to bring the Bible's views about marriage into our own world is risky. It can import or reinforce attitudes about the subordination of women and the control of women's bodies that I don't think we should be reinforcing. And I'm sorry to say that we do see that attitude a lot more prevalent now than I remember seeing it even a decade ago. Now, practicing safer text, though, will look for safer alternatives. If the Bible is easily pulled into the rationalization for those damaging attitudes toward women and women's sexuality, then we want to ask, okay, are there safer ways to read the Bible? Are there alternatives? And so I want to call attention to one. I'm intentionally choosing a kind of extreme one, but there are more spots in between. But let me call attention to the Song of Songs as a kind of extreme. I don't mean extreme in a negative way. I mean radically different position than the ones I was just describing. We don't have time here for a full discussion of the Song of Songs, which is too bad because it's one of the most interesting books in the Bible and also very relevant to our topic for today. But one of the most interesting things about Song of Songs, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is that it includes some surprisingly graphic representations of sexuality. This is something that many people just don't expect to see in the Bible. And of course, a lot of readers interpret the Song of Songs and its very sexual passages as a kind of allegory or symbolic representation of the relationship between God and Israel, or in Christianity, between Christ and the church. That's a very old way of reading Song of Songs that you can still find. And that allegorical interpretation is facilitated by the fact that the book itself does make use of a lot of symbolism and metaphor. If the Song of Songs wants to talk about oral sex, for example, it tends to talk about eating luscious fruit and so on. And so there's a symbol system at work, but once you realize what's taking place, what the symbol system is referring to, it can be quite shocking how graphic the Song of Songs is. And even the early church fathers who encouraged Christians to read Song of Songs, but they encouraged Christians to read it allegorically, they seem to have recognized that underneath the symbolism, the picture of sexuality that we bring away from the book can be quite graphic, because some religious authorities argued that young people, especially boys and young men, should not be permitted to read the Song of Songs without an older authority there to tell them how to interpret it, because they were afraid, as they put it, that the young boys would read the Song of Songs in a carnal way, and that it would be understood as talking about bodies and sex. Well, today, most biblical scholars agree that the book really is trying to talk about bodies and sex with this symbol system. But what is even more interesting about Song of Songs, in light of the views about women and marriage that I touched on just a moment ago, is that Song of Songs, to an extent that surpasses, I think, any other part of the Hebrew Bible, underscores the legitimacy and the value of women's sexuality and of women's sexual agency. The emphasis falls on women's desires and on the right of women to pursue those desires, even when their male relatives don't want her to, and even when male authorities are opposed to women's sexual agency. There are women's voices and men's voices in the book, and they both articulate sexual desires and give a positive representation of sexual activity. But the women's voices are actually a little more numerous. And in fact, the emphasis on women's voices and women's sexuality is so strong that some biblical scholars have argued that Song of Songs might be the only book in the Bible to have actually been written by a woman. This was argued by, among others, my predecessor in Hebrew Bible at Chicago Theological Seminary, a scholar named Andre Lecoq. Andre went so far as to argue that the woman who wrote Song of Songs was actually writing in order to subvert damaging attitudes towards women's sexuality that we can find in some other books of the Bible. That may seem a little surprising because we sometimes imagine the Bible as a single book with a unified message. But as biblical scholars often note, in fact, the Bible is really a library of text with many different perspectives, some of which disagree with one another. And Andre argued that the woman he believed wrote Song of Songs did so in order to counter views about women's sexuality and sexual agency, damaging views about women's sexuality and sexual agency that could be found in other books of the Bible. And we don't have to decide whether to go as far as Andre did in order to see that Song of Songs takes a dissident view on women's sexual agency. And it takes a view that I think many of us would be more likely to agree with today, that women can choose for themselves who to love and when to act on their desires. And personally, I would extend that principle of interpretation to gay men and lesbians as well. So in conclusion, I've run through a lot of things very quickly here, but in conclusion, I just want to come back to my framework of practicing safer text, because I think if you juxtapose the texts on marriage that give women sexual agency to their fathers and husbands on the one hand, with a text like Song of Songs that grants sexual agency to women, even in the face of opposition from men on the other hand, what I would argue is that the first set of texts, which limits women's sexual agency, they represent risk, danger, harm, the danger of the subordination of women to men, and in some cases, the violent subordination of women to men, while Song of Songs represents pleasure, agency, safer perspectives on women's sexuality. So if our relationship to the Bible was defined by practicing safer text, then we could spend a lot less time reading and promoting passages that constrain sexual desire and agency, and more time reading and promoting countertext, such as the Song of Songs, which admittedly is a minority view in the Bible, but it's a view there nonetheless. And just as safer sex is a matter of what you do, where, with whom, so also biblical interpretation, I think, is partly a matter of what you read, where, with whom, toward the end of reducing harm and reducing risk. So with that, I'm going to stop and see if we have any questions or comments.
Thank you, Dr. Stone. That was really insightful. And I'd love to kick off our question and answer time here. And for those of you who are listening to the webinar or watching it here, feel free to continue to put your own questions in the chat, and we'll pull from those as the question and answer time goes on. But if I could maybe kick things off by asking a little bit of a devil's advocate question here, Dr. Stone. So I could hear somebody responding to what you've just presented to us as a kind of promoting a canon within the canon of Scripture. And for many of us, our traditions ask us to take the whole of Scripture into account. So what would you say to folks who still desire to not just, cut out of Scripture only those that they find most appealing, but want to take all of Scripture into account? Is there an approach that would lend itself to dialogue between these passages that are in tension, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, good question. I'm not myself intentionally trying to argue for a canon within the canon per se, because I'm trying to argue for a pragmatic approach, which means that it would depend a little bit on what the issues were we were discussing. Let me say, first of all, right? So in some texts, let me use the Ten Commandments because I intentionally chose that as a provocative example. I don't think that verse from the Ten Commandments ought to be the place that we go right now to figure out what the relationship between women and men is, or should be, right? But that doesn't mean I want to get rid of the Ten Commandments. I'm not trying to rip the Ten Commandments or even that verse out of the Bible. I think we need to have a good conversation about what was actually the principle behind that passage and so forth. At the same time, I do think that one thing maybe biblical scholars and theologians are not quite as honest enough as we ought to be sometimes is acknowledging as a starting point that we do all choose to emphasize some text rather than others, right? That there's never been a time when people were taking the whole of Scripture into account and, you know, taking it all in the same way and applying it to their circumstances. I would even argue, I mentioned allegorical interpretation a while ago. That's sort of how allegorical interpretation of the Hebrew Bible became so important in Christianity. They had to figure out what to do with all of these texts that weren't immediately relevant to the circumstances with which they were dealing, and they picked up what was already a mode of interpretation in the Judaism of their day. So I think there is always a sense in which people do choose to focus on some texts rather than others. I think that's a given, and we ought to acknowledge it as such, and then ask what are the principles we use when we decide which text ought to be appealed to by these people in these circumstances. And that's where I think the question of harm reduction, practicing safer texts, and so forth comes in. I think that ought to play a larger role than some of the more implicit assumptions that people make about which texts to emphasize and which ones not to. I realize there's a lot more we could say about that question, but that would be my initial answer.
Okay. We have a question from Cindy. Let me put it up here for you to see, Ken. What does the practice of safer texts teach us about repair and healing after injury has resulted from harmful biblical interpretation? Were you able to see it, Ken?
Yes. Can you hear me okay? It looks like I went out for a second. All right. That's a great question. I think, and this actually will allow me to come back to something from the previous question. That is a question where I think people other than myself have to be called in, because as you know, there are people, probably a lot of people on this call are involved in professional ministry and have a lot of skills in dealing with moral injury, in dealing with the actual impact on people of harm. I don't think a biblical scholar is necessarily all that helpful in that circumstances. That's not a slam on any individual biblical scholars. It's just that that's not the tools that we're encouraged to develop, but it is certainly on any seminary faculty. There are usually people who are involved in pastoral counseling, dealing with moral injury and so forth, with people who've been harmed. I think they have to be called into to deal with this question. We have to call those members of our community in at that point. This also allows me to come back to the previous question in this respect. When we're trying to sort out what the issues are that we use to evaluate text and bring them in, it requires a whole community. I mean, I'm here as one biblical scholar who's told you a little bit about myself, giving an opinion. But for this really to play out in the community level, we need everybody's input and everybody's skill. And I think this question about how we deal with moral injury is important. I do think that there are texts in the Hebrew Bible that would be very useful there, especially I teach a class at our CTS on suffering and lament. I think the lament tradition is one of the great underutilized resources in the Bible for ministers who are dealing with moral injury with the people that they're working with. And so I would encourage that type of attention to biblical literature in dealing with Cindy's great question. But I don't think Bible alone answers the question. I think there's a whole community healing aspect that needs to be brought in.
Okay. Let me see. We have a question from Ben. I would like to hear this talk continue into the New Testament. If I were to use this video as a tool to help conversation with those who disagree, I feel their first argument would be, but what about the New Testament?
Yes, thank you, Ben. I would also like to hear this conversation carried into the New Testament. I agree with you about that. I do think it's relevant. I think that to oversimplify things a little bit, the issues that I've been talking about in terms of sexuality and marriage, I think are more prevalent and obvious in the Hebrew Bible than they seem to me when I read the New Testament. But New Testament is not actually my specialization, so I don't feel like I have all the details in my head that I would like to at any given moment. But I agree that it ought to be extended there. I'm just not entirely clear about how to do it. What I would say about my specific examples about marriage and sexuality is that I think those really do need to be grappled with in a serious way, because I don't think that the New Testament solves the Hebrew Bible as a problem. I intentionally didn't go to the New Testament for a positive text. I intentionally went to another one in the Hebrew Bible, the Song of Songs, because I think that the same challenge of acknowledging value and acknowledging risk, both of those pieces would also be there in the New Testament, in my opinion. But I think someone who works more closely with the New Testament than I do would need to work through those issues. The volume of essays that in Bible Trouble that were called to attention earlier, that's equally New Testament. There might even be more New Testament essays in there than Hebrew Bible, written by New Testament scholars. So that might be one starting place.
If I may jump in here a little bit, though, it would be the same assumptions are at work in the New Testament as with the Hebrew Bible, in the sense that, if I heard you correctly in the beginning, understanding the question, the meta narrative of marriage and sexuality would also apply to understanding the meta narrative that's existing in the world behind the New Testament. That is, both of those worlds may not be helpful in understanding some of the questions we have on marriage and sexuality today. Is what I think those things will carry over. But let me go to another question here from Megan. What are your thoughts on faithful people being in polyamorous relationships, especially in connection to your words on marriage and agency?
Wow. Yeah, you came with the real questions today, didn't you? So that's a tricky one, because there's my biblical scholar answer to that, and then there would be my personal answer to that. I think that let me put on the biblical scholar hat for a minute and just say that we don't have time to sort this out, but I think it could easily be shown that monogamy carries a much lower value in the Hebrew Bible than it does, at least officially, in our conversations about marriage today. It's a polygynous society, not polygamous, but polygynous, in the sense that men seem to have been allowed, if they could afford it and the circumstances permitted, to have more than one woman. Now, in the Hebrew Bible itself, that doesn't work out that well for the women involved, right? I mean, there are you could take stories from the Hebrew Bible about polygyny, and use those to argue against any kind of polyamorous relationship. And I think that does raise a really important question for harm reduction. Does a polyamorous relationship per se open up more opportunities for harm? I think that's a good question. I don't know that I have the answer to that. I think that there probably is more room in the complexities of people's lives for, first of all, a lot of people are already in polyamorous relationships, more so than we permit conversation about in religious communities. So I think that there ought to be conversations about it. But here again, I don't assume, as a biblical scholar, even one who has opinions about sexuality and kinship, I don't assume that I have the answer to that for the community at large. I just don't. But I do think it ought to be a real conversation. I do think it would be something that ought to be discussed. But again, from my perspective, it ought to be discussed in the framework of asking, where are the benefits and where is the harm? What are the risks? And if people are going to enter those types of relationships, are there ways to reduce the risks? Are there ways to reduce the harm? That's where I think actually the motto of safer sex is really useful, because it doesn't just say there's harmful and there's safe. It's no, safer means that there are degrees of risk. And I think that same sophistication that people eventually learned to deal with in their sexual relationships ought to be brought to this question and similar ones about what types of relationships we might have today.
Great. Let's try to get a couple more questions in. Here's a question from Shelby. You have given us an excellent example of a safer text for discussing women's sexuality. Do you have any texts that are helpful in supporting our trans brothers and sisters, given the current attacks on that population?
That's a great question too. You all ask really good questions. Okay. I would actually like to do a whole session on this, but I would say there are two things that I would want to look for. One would be, I do think that there are a surprisingly large number of passages in the Hebrew Bible, at least, maybe the New Testament, too, where gender is much less fixed. It's much more dynamic than a lot of readers of the Bible tend to assume. And you can find biblical characters acting in ways that totally conform to the gender expectations of the ancient world. But you can also find texts where the characters, sometimes the same characters, act in ways that sort of undermine the conventions about gender in the ancient world. I think we need more attention to those types of texts where you find, for example, you could take stories about women who do assume agency in the text in some surprising ways, like Tamar, the daughter-in-law of Judah, Deborah and Yael in the stories in Judges 4 and 5. Women characters who go against gender conventions in the stories that are told about them, sometimes as with Tamar in sexual ways. You could lift out of those stories a principle of gender that is more dynamic, less fixed, certainly not binary, that would allow you to work out ways of reading some parts of the Bible as being a more useful resource for trans readers than most biblical interpretations are. And there are scholars working on this, on trans biblical interpretation. I also think it's useful to remember, and this will be the second part. I said there were a couple of things that occurred to me. Even if we think about what text people often appeal to sort of reinforce a binary notion of gender from the Bible, they often look at Genesis, the emphasis there on men and women and so forth. It's useful to remember that in early rabbinic interpretation, some of the Jewish interpreters of the Bible recognized a challenge. When they read through Genesis, they saw, oh, wait, there's a reference in Genesis 1 to male and female, but it's only in Genesis 2 that you actually get the creation of two differently sexed humans out of one. So it's like you've got male and female. They said you've got male and female there, but only one body. And what did they assume? They decided that God first made a human character, a human figure who was both male and female. How do you know? Because Genesis 1 says there's male and female are both there, right? And it's only later that you get a kind of a splitting of this human into two. Now, biblical scholars today would say, yeah, but those are two different stories. But that's not how the rabbis read it. The traditional reading was to see this as one narrative And so they said, we started off with a more they didn't use that term, obviously, but we started off with a more transgender body that got split. One of my colleagues said, there's like a gender transition surgery takes place in the move from Genesis 1 to Genesis 2, when God splits that body into male and female. So I think there are ways to read it, but you really have to get out of the weight of interpretive tradition to habituate yourself to finding these more dynamic representations of gender in the biblical text, but also in the history of biblical interpretation, such as that example that I just gave of how some of the Jewish readers read Genesis 1 and 2.
Okay. Let's take one more question. Let's see, from Charity. In many churches, the conversation of desire and pleasure have been limited to those who are married. Do you have any additional resources that will assist the conversation of single woman, agency, faith, and pleasure?
Great question. This time I'm prepared for it. I didn't say this a while ago, but notwithstanding the way the Song of Songs is usually read, there's really not much evidence in the Song of Songs that it was written about marriage. It's definitely written about sex, and it's definitely written about sexual desire, and it definitely highlights women's sexual desire. But it seems very much that the primary woman speaking voice in the text wants to be with a man. She's not currently with him. It's about her wanting to fulfill her desire, not about marriage, even though it is often read as a book about marriage. That's most often when it's read in religious communities today, is as an affirmation of marriage. There is very little inside the Song of Songs itself which indicates that it's a marriage, that it's talking about marriage. So I would say I would go point to the same book for single women in this case that I would point to for married women. Okay.
We've reached the sort of the end. And let me just more of a comment than a question. When I'm thinking going back to Ben's question in the New Testament, because that's my area a little bit. There is not and I would need to go back, and I didn't prepare for this, but I don't recall anything directly in the Gospels themselves speaking about with Jesus really engaged in this question of sexuality per se, other than through divorce or through relationship with women, that sort of thing. There's definitely questions of sexuality and prohibitions of types of sexuality in Pauline literature, but I think those are two different distinctions, two different places. And there's, as you know, it's much more complicated. I don't read the New Testament as a collection, so so for me they're separate individual texts written in certain particular periods with certain sort of historical, social understanding behind it. If you can conclude just with one takeaway, or maybe two takeaways for our audience today, what would they be?
From me,
yeah,
I would want to really emphasize the importance, especially for ministers, of being honest with everyone about what's there in the text, but also acknowledging the possibility of risk and harm, not by hiding the dangerous text, but rather by being a little more upfront about the fact that we're reading with a principle of harm reduction, so that people don't come away from the harm reduction principle, the practicing safer text principle, assuming that it's all good, all safe, because their minister only read the safe stuff. I think it would be better for people to actually talk about what we're doing when we have very good reasons for reading some texts more than others, and reading some texts with more intentional focus on the well-being of the people that we're working with.
Thank you. Tim, do you want to bring us to a close, or?
Sure. Thank you so much, Ken Stone, for being with us today and for sharing your insights. It's been really provocative and interesting, and it's given us a lot to chew on. So thank you so much for giving us of your time for this, and we really appreciate that. And thanks to all of you who've been watching, tuning in, and we invite you to join us for the next in the series. Until then, thanks so much for being a part of this.
Yes. Thank you.